Good afternoon, folks.
Afternoon.
Last session of the day. I'm sure your brains are as full as mine, but thank you for making time for this. As we get started on the topic of documentation, just to level set up front, how many folks in the room are actually developers who are looking to improve documentation skills? Oh, awesome, most of the room, fantastic. How many of you are project owners trying to make your developers write documentation? All right. Excellent. Okay. Well, we're going to try to make it as simple as possible. So part of what we're going to talk about today are tips and tricks on both sides of that great divide. Things we're going to talk about today, just to give you a little bit more background on me up front. As they said, my name is Katherine White. I am the Director of Engineering at Canopy Studios. We are a digital development agency. We specialize in WordPress and Drupal development. And I do a lot of work with clients in higher education, in nonprofit, and as well as in small medium business. And at Canopy, one thing we do is we're split about 50-50 between working with our clients on rebuilds of their sites or new builds of their sites. And then about 50% of our business is in support, where folks with pre-existing WordPress sites, pre-existing Drupal sites come into my organization desperate for help. And that is honestly where my passion for this particular topic was born. Because documentation, the documentation of your code base and your project becomes so critical to the length of the life of your project. And as code passes hands, making sure that people are able to be as efficient as possible and move your project forward in the way which you intended. So we're going to talk about a bunch of things in the next 40 minutes. We're going to talk about why documentation matters. This is one of those things that as developers we're constantly asked to do. Why is it important? Who are our audiences that we're writing for, typically, within our organizations? When we talk about documentation, sometimes there's nothing as terrifying as that blank page. So what are the kinds of things that we need to include in our documentation for it to be substantive and helpful? Tools that we can use and tips that we can use for writing those documents. And then we're going to talk about how to keep it fresh over the course of your project lifecycle. And finally, how do we make this happen? How do we build this into our process so it's something that we're constantly thinking about? So why does it matter? Everybody's always asking you for documentation. Why is it important? Why do they care? Why should you care? It really boils down to what I consider to be three main areas: the maintainability of your code, the community that you're trying to build around your code, and then there's the personal development component to this as well. The number one reason I ask developers to write documentation is that, especially in an institution, in higher education, you will be using this code a year from now. We are building for the long game. We are doing things, projects that need to last, that needs to withstand the test of time and be extensible. But the reality is, as a developer, that new cute, kitschy trick you learned, that you go and then build into your code, you come back to that code 6 months from now, and it's going to look like it was built by a stranger, a mad genius. I cannot tell you the number of times that I myself have looked at plugins I've written a year or so ago, and I go, wow, I was really smart. I don't know what I was doing, and I can't read it now, but I was clearly brilliant at that point in time. Or you look at it and you're just horribly embarrassed, and you think about how much you've grown and learned since then, and how, horribly inefficient this is. But the reality is, you wouldn't recognize it as your own code. The flip side of that is that somebody else may be using your code in a year. So I found an interesting statistic in the Stack Overflow developer surveys that they do every year, that almost 35% of developers cite poor documentation as one of their primary frustrations at work. It's right behind unrealistic expectations, which of course we're all very, very familiar with. So don't be this person. Don't be this person that causes 35% of our colleagues pain and suffering at work. Even if you are no longer maintaining the code, somebody else will be. From an adoption and community standpoint, There's nothing more frustrating than building code that people don't use. One of the challenges we face in higher education, as you've probably heard pervasively throughout the conference here, is this decentralization problem that we all deal with our websites. You can expend a great deal of effort on the one system solution only to have random research groups and departments not adopt it. If you want people to use it, you have to make it easy to figure out. You've got to make it clear what the solution is for, why they should use it, why they should be a part of this community that we're trying to build. To encourage their participation, they've got to understand the value of what you're putting out there, and you've got to make it easy for them to be a part of it. As an individual developer, from a personal development standpoint, documentation is actually critical if you want to write stronger and better code. The best way to make sure that you understand what you're doing is to have to explain it to somebody else. This is where, conversation with your peers, bouncing things around, talking about your architectural decisions, you begin to see holes in what you're doing, right? Documentation is another way to do that. Sometimes I will actually start more or less with the documentation and describing what it is I'm about to build, because I'll begin to see the holes in it before I've even really gotten started. And candidly, there's a marketability component to this. Developers who can actually be articulate in writing are extraordinarily rare. Working on your writing skills, practicing your writing skills, being able to present technical concepts to less technical audiences, all of these make you a more valuable employee and a more valuable developer. And the more that you write, the more that you practice this, the easier it will become to do it over time. So who are the people as developers we're actually writing for? And when we're talking about writing in the context of this discussion, this is not a talk about PHP doc. Okay? This is a conversation about higher level documentation, about what your project actually does, why it does it, and who it's for. So in the who it's for department, who are the people that we're talking to? The people who influence the documentation that we write. First, we've got stakeholders. And I've done these kind of as rough personas. And sometimes as developers, I think we feel like we're so far removed from the stakeholders that the stuff that we do in our day-to-day doesn't matter. But that's actually not true. Your stakeholders may be technical. Your stakeholders may be central IT. One thing you can be sure of is that they understand the business requirements. Why they've set out on the path to doing this site, doing this project, what the organizational impact of that project is and why they care about it. They help fund our work. And when we talk about the adoption component of building that community, they help to drive that from the top down, or they can kill your project dead. So making sure that the documentation you provide gives them the high level context to understand its benefit is actually critical. Implementers in our context could be developers, but they aren't necessarily. People who are implementing have a problem that they need to solve. They may have varying levels of technical facility. This may be a student webmaster who's helping out with something. This may be an IT professional. Inevitably, especially in higher education, they're going to be strapped for time and resources. So making sure that the project is easy to pick up on quickly and implement and use is critical. They want to interact with your functionality, but not necessarily with your code. And if you are fortunate enough to working in an institution where you have the opportunity to open source some of your work, this may or may not be somebody who's internal to your organization. The final audience, of course, that we want to talk about are our developers. That's the people who are in the weeds, the folks who are adapting and extending, building on your code. From outside your organization, these could be potentially people who are interested in being a part of your project. They want to contribute back to the open source community. What you've done has attracted their attention. They want to build on it and adapt. These can be your technical teammates, or these could be people you just don't even know who are going to be supporting this work long term in the event the project gets handed off down the road. So those are a lot of different audiences with a lot of conflicting needs. So what do we need to include when we're writing documentation for them? And we're going to speak specifically here about documentation quality as it pertains to plugins that you're producing. So when we talk about a good, high-quality plugin, we talk about high-quality code. There's a documentation component to that as well. So when we are writing up information on our project for the community at large, stuff that applies to pretty much anybody who might be looking at this plugin, there are some fundamentals that you want to make sure you address. Number one, what's the problem you're solving? Nobody's going to use a plugin if they don't understand what it's for. How does this solve my problem? Give a basic example of how the thing works. Pick a really common use case though, don't get cute and fun with it. Make it simple, make it approachable. Definition of how the most common use case for the thing. And then beyond that, what are the major features that your functionality provides? The next step is, how do you install this thing? And I can't emphasize enough here, make no assumptions. Make no assumptions about the way someone's system is configured, about the way someone's site is configured. When it comes to installing the code, if there are dependencies, people need to know that up front, which is also part of what is it built with? Are there tools that you're using? Are there versions that matter? Provide that information so that people set them up for success, so that people out the gate are able to get your project running the way that you intended quickly. Where can you get help? It is so important, especially if you are open sourcing a project, that people can get in touch with a human. That can be your issue queue, that can be a Slack channel, that can be a lot of different things, depending on what works for you and your organization. But make sure that there's a way that they can ultimately have a conversation with somebody if they're having trouble. When can you use it? So with any plugin that we write, there's the licensing considerations of when it's okay to use this plugin. What is the license that's associated with it? How am I able to adapt and build and modify on this piece of code? And then finally, let people know what's changed. If you've got code that's been in the wild for a while, you may have people using really old versions of it. Make sure that you're being clear about new features and functionality or stuff that you're no longer supporting or things that may have changed before they hit that upgrade button, so that they don't break their whole site. Then there are the folks that actually want to be in the code. And this can vary based on whether you are inside of an organization. I might tell you to include slightly different things than if it's in an open source context. But how do you set up a local? So again, if you're going to build a local development environment to work on this code, what does that look like? Again, make no assumptions about what people have installed. How is the project architected? This is an opportunity to own your crazy. If there are weird things in the code, let people know that up front. Let them know where to find certain types of things if they may be looking for a specific aspect or feature of your code. For contribution, define the rules of the road. There's no feeling that hurts more than trying to get out there and be a part of something and issue a PR and you're rejected. So again, set developers up for success by letting them know what your expectations are up front about what testing process the code has been through, what they're expected to provide when they issue a PR, that kind of thing. And then finally, and this is important from a more internal perspective, if you have deployment guidelines that people need to follow, or if they're just little gotchas like, hey, when you deploy this code, make sure you clear the cache, that kind of thing. Go ahead and note those here as well, because this is really the care and feeding of the code from a developer perspective. That is a lot of information to write about, especially for people who do not like to write. So what kind of assistance is there out there for actually writing our docs? Up front, I want to say this doesn't have to be hard. But I do want to say that your writing does matter. So complete sentences matter. Approachability matters. The structure of your documentation matters. Avoid getting overly technical. Don't get complicated when simple will do. Be approachable. If there are third-party tools or supporting documentation that helps people understand the scope of your project, link those in. If you are using a lot of acronyms, technical terms, link those in as well. This may be a really senior developer looking at your project who knows all this stuff. It may be somebody who's just getting started. So help them understand what these things are. One thing I like to do when I'm writing documentation is think in stories. Now, if you work in an environment where you're following an agile workflow, user stories may be a really familiar concept. If you're not, then it may be something new. But as a developer, I actually find them to be a great tool for helping me simplify my explanation as to what I am building and why I am building it. So user stories follow this format of, as a person, I should be able to do a thing for a reason. And taking that concept can really help you mentally figure out how to articulate what your little piece of the WordPress world does and why it doesn't. Documentation is useless if it's not up to date. So be consistent with your project. Update your documentation as you plan, as you build. Getting into this habit, my developers have come back and confessed to me that once they develop this habit, it's so much less painful because they don't have to go back at the very, very end of the project and start writing this. Just like if you build all your doc blocks as you go, you don't have to go back and painstakingly add all your function level documentation after you've already built the thing. Don't scope creep yourself. So what I mean here is once you get on a roll with this, it can become really easy to just throw the kitchen sink at it and document everything you can possibly think of. Part of the reason I recommend this approach to managing your documentation is because nobody likes lengthy spec documents. So as much as possible, break up your documentation so that it lives at the deepest possible level. So by that I mean, if you look at, say, the Gutenberg plugin, the way they've structured their documentation, as you drill deeper through the plugin, you get different levels of information. It's a really nice structure that makes what you're reading bite-sized and also more maintainable. I also encourage developers to do what we know. We live and breathe in text editors. Plain text is our happy place. So document that way. Use simple text-based formats to document your code. Don't make it hard. I usually recommend Markdown. There are a lot of other plain text formats. This just happens to be what I use. And that's largely because I do all of my work in GitHub. So that's going to be the bias of this particular discussion. In terms of how to structure these documents, right? So, okay, we're going to work in Markdown. Cool. Where do we start? We start with a README. This is your really, really basic overview. And we're talking about this in the concept of it in the context of a plugin, but I also encourage READMEs at the theme level, at your overall project level. It's kind of the welcome page for your functionality. So this is where a lot of the high-level overview stuff that we talked about should go. If you've got no other piece of documentation in your repository, have this one. We touched on this briefly already, but have a license file. If you're working with WordPress, then you're going to want to use something that is compatible with GPL version 2 or higher. ChooseAlicense.com is a great tool. It just asks you human language questions to help you find the right license for what it is that you're doing. The third file in importance, from my perspective, if you're going to have one, is a contribute file. This goes back to those rules of the road we talked about. So your contribution content is patching, code review practices, development-specific criteria, stuff you're going to be looking for when somebody issues a pull request and is trying to submit code to your project. Getting started as a writer can be really intimidating if writing is not your thing. So I did want to also include some resources here that can help with the structure and content of your high-level documentation. So Grammarly is a writing assistant. If you don't use it, I highly encourage it, especially if you use webmail clients a lot. This is a free plugin that will correct your grammar, it will correct your spelling. It will look at your sentence structure and make recommendations. So it can really help with the quality of your writing. Readable.io is another great tool that does the same types of things. It'll look for passive voice. It'll give you the reading level of your content, which from an accessibility standpoint matters. The lower you can make the grade level of the content that you're writing, the more it's going to be accessible to people. And the Hemingway editor is another tool that does similar things. So in terms of boning up on your writing skills, those are great tools to know about. If you, by the way, I see folks taking pictures. If you want to download these slides, I do have the link in the deck and it will be posted on the site. But if you download them, all of these are links that you can access for materials. So, and then I also included just a couple of things for working with Markdown. If Markdown's really unfamiliar, Stack Edit's a good place to start because it gives you kind of a side-by-side comparison of here I am writing it in Markdown. And here's what it actually looks like in HTML. Cool, okay. And then just a couple of other cheat sheets there to help get you started with that. So once we've built all this beautiful documentation, that's neat, how do we keep it fresh? Well, we need to have a canonical source because just like decentralized sites are painful for us to maintain, decentralized documentation also hurts. Relying on things that live over here in Jira and things that live over here in the code base and things that live somewhere else is a little bit painful. So I like to try to make one canonical source that references everything as much as possible. Again, be reasonable here because don't, this is not a hill to die on. But it's good to track our changes over time. So when we keep documentation in our version control system, like we're talking about with Markdown files in your code base, you get a picture as your code requirements evolve of where you've been and where you're going. That said, if you're not using version control, it's a much more important conversation than this one, so we can chat afterwards. But track your changes over time as a part of your code base. It's basically a freebie that you get with doing things this way. Keeping it with that code is also the only place that I know that developers will actually look at it. Maybe your organization is different from mine, but what I have found is if it travels with the code base, which is the only thing that's going to exist for the life of the code, then nobody has an excuse not to have seen it. And I recommend if you're using version control and using Git workflow, leverage your pull requests as an opportunity to provide further documentation about key points in the evolution of your project. So I recommend, and what we do at Canopy is we use a template for this to add some structure to it that makes sure that people are providing before and after screenshots, URLs that are affected, any additional information, dependencies that are added as a part of this pull request, etc. So your pull requests can represent these key intersections and points of inclusion of functionality on your site that can provide a little more detail that then don't require anybody to dig back into a granular commit history. Same thing with release notes. So we talked a little bit about keeping your change log. This is also a good place to articulate that information if you're tagging a release, making sure that you're being clear about what's been added and what's changed. One interesting thing we've started to do is actually build our project requirements in Markdown and keep them in a docs folder that lives as a part of the site. So you can use this model to extend documentation up to that stakeholder level. So it can support our full requirements documentation and have that live with the site, along with the user manual, along with code, so that everything is packaged together. When we take that approach, I then recommend, and even just for your README file, generating a static site. So if you use GitHub, for example, you can produce your documentation and very, very easily publish something out to GitHub pages to get your site up online, where documentation is more easily browsed than it is inside of your repository. The tools I mentioned here, MakeDocs is what we use, but Couscous is another PHP-based tool. These create HTML documentation sites that will take like a big collection of Markdown files and give you a beautiful site out of it. We take this approach because Markdown on its own does have limitations if you're going to start getting into complex documentation structures. because it's harder to have a table of contents. It's harder to be able to structure the information. So this helps you get around some of those limitations. And I mentioned GitHub Pages, but there are other options if you're not using GitHub. The hosts like Read the Docs or Netlify, I think I say that right, not positive. But they make it very easy and in many cases free to create static documentation sites for your projects. That sounds awesome. We would all know what's going on. It would be incredible. How do we make that happen? How do we build this into everyday life? My solution has been to make it a part of our workflow. So we actually will reject pull requests within my agency if the documentation is not included as part of the pull request. So drives everybody crazy, but it means that I get docs as a go. So that consistency is key. And again, trying to bring it down to the micro level as opposed to the macro level to make it a little bit easier and a little less painful and a little less daunting. We'll do it on a pull request by pull request basis and make those updates to docs. The other thing I want to say with regards to making it happen is that something is better than none, as long as it's accurate. So start small. Again, just have a README. And even if your README is not, the most beautifully complex and complete thing it could be, it's a start. So I would caution against not starting down this road because you don't have a full-fledged plan. Incremental improvement is a thing. To that end, the best is the enemy of the good. So as a writer, as an aspiring fiction writer, first draft's always terrible, right? But it's a draft. So just get it written and then go back and polish, make it better, get feedback on it. People will have questions, will have issues come in. It gives you more information to add to your project to help other people who might run into that same issue. So don't be afraid to get started just because it's not perfect. That's it. So are there questions, feedback, thoughts? I have the link up there for feedback on the session, and of course, you're welcome to hit me up on Twitter after this, but I'd love to get thoughts and questions up front. Sure.
Do you have an example of a public plugin or open source project that you found the documentation to be excellent and exceed your expectations?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I know we actually, it's going to sound silly, but I did mention it, and I know that everything is still very much in flux, but I have been really impressed with the level of effort that's gone into the Gutenberg documentation, regardless of how you feel about Gutenberg. They're doing, I think, a stellar job with this. Also linked in the deck, I've got some examples of pull request templates that I think are really nice and full featured. What are some other plugins that I'm really impressed with their plugin level documentation? I'll have to think on that. That's the one that jumps out at me up front, and maybe that's just because I'm spending time with me. So, yeah.
You mentioned the central source of documentation to help kind of keep it from being too decentralized. Is that something you implement currently? How do you do it? Any suggestions? I'm thinking there's some places have a wiki for non-code documentation and then stuff in code and without being too redundant. How do you do that?
So that's an interesting question. So the question was, this canonical source of documentation, have we achieved it? Where does it live? Wikis versus code level documentation. And it's actually a debate that I had a lot getting started down this road was, do I want to keep more user-facing documentation in my code base, or do I want to leverage the wiki feature that's available to me as part of my version control system to present that information? For better or for worse, I have chosen to go the route of keep it in the code and publish on GitHub Pages, as opposed to really leveraging the wiki feature. But that being said, this is mostly stuff I'm building for clients, and it's not stuff that is really contributed back to the community. I think user level documentation in the wiki in that context makes more sense. But what I am doing right now is, in terms of the canonical source of documentation, is using the code base. So what we're doing right now, and it's been an interesting experiment, we've done it with several clients, and we're continuing to iterate on it, is produce one of these documentation websites that we use for our requirements discussions with our stakeholders. And that contains all the user stories and all of that information that then gets pulled out of the markdown and magically magically set up to become tasks in our system. We'll also keep links with all of our epics and things to the appropriate version of the wireframes, to the appropriate version of our content diagram, whatever it is, so that while those artifacts are actually decentralized, we have one place where developers go to know everything they need to know to build the thing. So it may not be truly the single source of truth because we have these other documents that are better served by better applications, but they know that there's one place to go to know exactly what version of what they should be looking at. Yeah.
Would you do anything differently or change anything for like sort of a systems level documentation? So like bringing on a new developer and they have to learn about your server structure or things like that so that they can start working in your code environment?
That's a good question. So the question was system level documentation. And we really focused on kind of the plugin level. But the reality is, to your point, there are all sorts of different levels of documentation, right? And I feel like this code-based approach has a pretty specific use case. So in terms of systems level documentation, I wouldn't approach that this way.
Okay.
That said, what we've tended to do is certain components of it live that way, but we have kind of a larger, and I actually use a wiki for this that's internal, that point to various projects. So for example, when it comes to our deployment process or our continuous integration process, well, those files actually live in a repo that's got its own documentation, but I have an external source that pulls all the pieces together to give people a larger scale view of the system.
Thanks.
Yeah. And it is one thing that when we are building a lot of custom plugins for a project, it goes back to that dependencies discussion of understanding how these pieces work together to create the system is something I'm trying to articulate as a part of the documentation of the individual components. This is the role that this component plays for this site. But again, that's more of an internal facing style as opposed to something that's designed, and the code may be designed with the ultimate intent to contribute it back. The documentation is designed for it to exist in a single context. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you evaluate the pull request to make sure that documentation is included, do you find yourself having to write her on the equivalent of the Git comment, fixed a bunch of bugs and some other stuff? Or do you reject subjectively based on the quality of it?
It is a little subjective. And it's an interesting question. So the question was, when we're doing documentation review as a part of the PR review, what are the parameters what is the case in which documentation will pass the PR and what's the context in which it will fail? And it is subjective. When I am looking at that, there are certain, and again, I use a template for this, which kind of helps. So I'm looking for specific information on not just, yeah, it's a bug and I fixed the stuff, but here's steps to reproduce. So here was the original issue. Here are the steps to reproduce so you can actually check the fix. Here are any dependencies I've added to the code base to help handle this fix. So we're looking for a certain level of specificity. But very specifically what I'm actually looking for is a restatement of the acceptance criteria that were part of the reason this was a thing to begin with. And then how do I validate against those criteria? Those are kind of my bare minimum things that I'm looking for. Good questions. All right. Guess we're good.